Your last lecture of the year on the last chapter of Foner's book is about September 11th, 2001, and the drastic shift that took place historically after that day. I was actually a senior in high school here at Lafayette on September 11th. I was sitting in a first period study hall, and the teacher in charge had someone come in and whisper something in her ear, and she lost it. She was sobbing. She had to leave the room and excuse herself. And I remember thinking, oh no, what kind of tragic news did she just get? Thinking that it was only something personal to her that wouldn't really be relevant to anyone else, other than being concerned for her. Well, come to find out, she had been told about the planes that had struck the World Trade Center in New York City, and the reason she was so upset is she had a son working on Wall Street. So while it was personal to her, it was also obviously nationwide a tragic event. 19 radical members of the Al Qaeda terrorist organization hijacked 4 different commercial airliners, ramming 2 of them into the World Trade Center in New York City and 1 into the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. And the last plane went down in a rural area of Pennsylvania in a township called Shanksville. And it was only after the heroic revolt against the terrorists that the passengers undertook to try to retake the plane. I can distinctly remember leaving that first period study hall being very worried about my teacher, and the loudspeaker came on and said, everybody go about your day as normal. And you're just thinking to yourself, this is weird. Why? What is going on? So I remember going down to one of my favorite teachers, who happened to be a history teacher, to her classroom and asking, what's going on? And she had the television tuned in to the news coverage of the smoking Twin Towers. And I can distinctly remember, is very vivid in my memory, and your parents or grandparents might tell you about vivid memories they have of historical moments, particularly tragic moments. It's almost like a PTSD thing that it's etched so specifically in your memory. And I remember her pointing at the screen of the 2 smoking towers, a more zoomed in view of what you can see here on the slide. And she was saying, and this was live coverage, she was saying, when this is all over, they should leave those buildings just the way they are, damaged just the way they are, so that people will never forget what happened. And no sooner than her finishing speaking did the first tower collapse. And everybody was just silent. What do you say? Nobody even gasped. Everyone was just stunned. And that evening, President Bush aired on television to try as best he could to reassure the American people. And a couple of quotes from his speech here. First, a great people has been moved to defend a great nation. Terrorist attacks can shake the foundations of our biggest buildings, but they cannot touch the foundation of America. These acts shattered steel, but they cannot dent the steel of American resolve. And really the theme here, the message is, we're all in this together. Let's stand together with each other tonight and in the weeks and months moving forward to address this issue together. He also said, we will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbor them. And the message of this second quote is, you're either with us or against us. And he's setting the stage for what was to come, because before he even spoke that night, he had been briefed by his national security advisor, Secretary of Defense, etc., of where this threat had come from. These were Al Qaeda terrorists working under the direct leadership of Osama bin Laden, and they were being harbored or aided by the Taliban government in Afghanistan. And these are all terms that are important to make a distinction of what they are and what they mean. A lot of people immediately following 9/11 used terms like Taliban or Al Qaeda interchangeably, and they are not the same thing. Taliban was the group that ruled over Afghanistan, and they were friendly with a terrorist organization known as Al Qaeda and allowed them to have all of their training in Afghanistan without anyone trying to stop them. President Bush vowed to topple the Taliban government if they did not turn over Osama bin Laden and as many other Al Qaeda operatives as they possibly could. The Taliban, naturally, because they had friendly relationships with Al Qaeda, refused, and so President Bush ordered the invasion of Afghanistan in October of 2001. Most Americans are very supportive of the invasion of Afghanistan because they see it as a measured response to what had happened on 9/11. After the fall of the Taliban, Bush repeatedly insists that this only marked the beginning of the war on terrorism. We are not only overthrowing the Taliban government, we are going to prevent any kind of terrorist act like 9/11 from ever happening again. And in his State of the Union address in 2002, the president accused Iraq, Iran, and North Korea of harboring terrorists and of developing and trying to develop even more weapons of mass destruction. And this foreshadowed what was to come, what a lot of people didn't yet know about. And that was some of the intelligence that had been gathered against Iraq and its weapons of mass destruction programs, biological weapons, chemical weapons, for example. And the U.S. Congress approved an Iraq resolution in October of 2002. So this is only 6 or so months after the State of the Union address in which he mentioned Iraq and mentioned weapons of mass destruction. Secretary of State Colin Powell addressed the United Nations in February of 2003 of U.S. intentions concerning Iraq. And the invasion of Iraq began in March of 2003 and very quickly toppled the Iraqi government headed by Saddam Hussein, who was the dictator in Iraq. Probably one of the most politically stupid moments in history is when President Bush gave a speech aboard an aircraft carrier on the 1st of May 2003, announcing the end of major combat operations in Iraq. Unfortunately, there was an insurgency that began after that announcement of the end of major combat operations, and a guerrilla war began against American troops. And soon, the American people began to ask a very, very painful question. Is Iraq another Vietnam? Is this going to turn into another Vietnam for us? And the moment is often just referred to as the mission accomplished speech, because he stood in front of a banner that said mission accomplished and said, you know, the major combat operations are over, we have been successful, but it all kind of came crashing down after that. Throughout the war on terror, there's controversial use of what could be referred to as torture, but was referred to by the people using the techniques as enhanced interrogation tactics. So the U.S. was being accused of torture, but said, no, we're using enhanced interrogation tactics. Publicly, President Bush repeatedly denied any use of torture by the U.S. military or the CIA. And waterboarding, it was later discovered, was defined only as this enhanced form of interrogation, not as torture. So they were hiding behind these fancy terminologies while using what people would consider torture. If you look at this graphic here, you can see someone who is strapped down and who is covered over the face with a towel. And when that towel has water poured down over it, it creates a seal over the person's ability to breathe through their mouth or nose and induces the feeling of, I am drowning. And you would do this to them, remove the towel, try to get them to tell you the information that you want from them. And if they did not, you would repeat the process. And this, although only referred to as enhanced interrogation tactics, was deemed after the fact to indeed be torture. There was also the Abu Ghraib prison scandal. This was a prison just outside of Baghdad, the capital city of Iraq, and it was under control of the U.S. military from 2003 to 2006. U.S. military personnel were accused of torturing, sexually abusing, and even murdering inmates in this prison. This famous photo at the right was on the cover of The Economist magazine, a British publication, in May of 2004, with the words, "Resign, Rumsfeld," included on the title. This is in reference to President Bush's Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, who had apparently personally approved of the methods being used at Abu Ghraib. Between the rumors of torture and the rumors that were later confirmed of what was going on at Abu Ghraib, people began to really question, was this war worth fighting, and were we doing so morally and ethically? It certainly was a topic of conversation in the election of 2004, in which President Bush was running for re-election against Senator from Massachusetts, John Kerry. John Kerry, a military veteran, was critical of Bush's handling of the situation in Iraq and said that he would do a better job. It was a very, very bitter campaign between the two. So the quagmire in Iraq was driving down President Bush's approval ratings. Senator Kerry's military experience was supposed to make him a good alternative to President Bush, but you had a lot of bitter campaign ads, particularly those questioning Senator Kerry's service during the Vietnam War. And after a bitter, bitter campaign, President Bush was reelected. Now, outside of the war on terror, you also had some tragic events happening domestically while President Bush was president, such as Hurricane Katrina. So in 2005, this massive hurricane pummeled the Gulf Coast. And in New Orleans, which is a city that happens to sit below sea level and only is kept safe from sea levels by levees holding ocean water back, these levees broke. They were overcome by the storm surge. And the federal government's delayed response was viewed to have been so seriously mismanaged that it undoubtedly led to the unnecessary deaths of many, many people. This further harmed the reputation of President Bush and his entire administration. At the very end of President Bush's time in office, you had the financial crisis. And the financial crisis was a lot of long-term things coming to a head in 2007 and 8. Throughout the 1990s, one of the long-term things that led to the financial crisis was the government encouraging banks to lend money to people in the lower middle income brackets who couldn't qualify for what's called a prime mortgage. Banks then began to lend subprime money to people who would otherwise not have qualified for those loans. In fact, the Department of Housing and Urban Development in the 90s could deny banks the right to expand or merge if they weren't lending at least half of their mortgages to low and middle income borrowers. These policies were enacted under President Clinton and then HUD Secretary Andrew Cuomo, and they continued under President Bush. But they finally came to a head in 2007. The housing bubble burst. So when many people who had signed these subprime mortgages began to fall behind on their payments and default on those payments, this spiraled out of control, and this housing bubble snowballed into a full-blown financial crisis very, very quickly. And you can see on this political cartoon how it really was the issue of these subprime mortgages depicted here as the edge of a cliff, propping up all of this weight above it of things like Wall Street and banks and hedge fund managers and securities, and everything financial was all going to come crashing down because of these subprime mortgages. And the silly quote here of, I thought we were just buying a house. And what that's supposed to symbolize is that the average middle or lower class homeowner was, unbeknownst to a lot of people, propping up the entire financial system via their subprime mortgages. In 2008, at the same time that a lot of these financial crisis issues were going on, you still had issues surrounding the war on terror. And one was, are terror suspects who are not U.S. citizens entitled to the right of the writ of habeas corpus in their legal proceedings? And this was decided in the court case Boumediene v. Bush. So there were, in fact, two cases decided in this case, and it all falls under the name Boumediene v. Bush, even though it was two different cases. So anyway, prisoners at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, naval base prison, were being held without formal charges being filed against them. And this led to that divisive question: are these people that the government is saying are foreign combatants and not even U.S. citizens entitled to the right of habeas corpus? So Justice Anthony Kennedy delivered the opinion for the 5-4 majority, holding that the prisoners had a right to the writ of habeas corpus under the U.S. Constitution. And so these suspects that could not have formal charges brought against them, despite efforts to find evidence for those charges, they had to be released because they are not being informed of their crime. Two contrasting views of this. One is that Justice Anthony Kennedy, depicted here, is releasing terrorists back out into the world from the prison at Guantanamo. This other perspective is a plumber digging through a toilet and saying, so far, I found the remains of 2 Qurans, 1 Bill of Rights, a Geneva Convention, a habeas corpus. You guys ever heard of toilet paper? And the joke being that all of these major legal precedents, both here at home and internationally, had been violated by President George W. Bush and Vice President Dick Cheney. In the election of 2008, President Bush was leaving office. He had already served 2 terms in office and could not run for re-election. And the Republican Party did not turn to his vice president, Dick Cheney, to run for office. He announced, in fact, back when he took the job as vice president, that he had no interest in running for president after President Bush's terms were over. So the Republican Party turned to John McCain, a longtime senator from Arizona, and the Democratic Party turned to a relatively new name in national politics, well known in the state of Illinois, but Senator Barack Obama from Illinois, specifically from Chicago. And he ran on a message of hope and change. Nothing terribly specific. If you listened to really wonky speeches on C-SPAN, then you probably would have heard many of the specifics. But on the campaign trail, President Obama and his campaign staff were really just focusing on, in general, hope and change. And with all of the turmoil surrounding the financial crisis, surrounding the war on terror, people turned to President Obama and the Democratic Party. So with the Republican Party definitely being looked at suspiciously, and with the Democratic Party and President Obama offering this new message, you can see here some of his campaign posters: hope, change, yes we can, vote Obama 2008, that he was elected, and I'll go back to the electoral map, by a pretty substantial margin. Even the popular vote was well into majority territory at 53%, and he took a resounding almost 68% of the Electoral College share. So, President Obama's 8 years in office, 2 terms, he was reelected in 2012. He had some major achievements, he had some major criticisms, just like a lot of presidents. So, some of the economic stimulus, like ERA and TARP, were meant to stabilize the economy. And he's also well known for the passage of the Affordable Care Act, often nicknamed Obamacare, to broaden access to health care, and the killing of Osama bin Laden in a raid on a compound that bin Laden was living in Abbottabad, Pakistan. So these are some high points of President Obama's presidency. Lower points were accusations of crony capitalism. At the same time that you had this economic stimulus, there were accusations that certain industries and companies were getting promoted and getting more money thrown at them, and then others were being targeted and not helped with any economic stimulus money. There was an attack on a U.S. embassy in Benghazi, Libya, on the anniversary of 9/11, and the accusations were that terrorism was not really being taken seriously anymore, and that Benghazi would not have happened had it been taken much more seriously. And then in his re-election campaign in 2012, President Obama is accused of utilizing the bureaucracy that serves under him in the executive branch to target conservative groups via the IRS, so not giving them tax preferred status like some other political action groups. And also there was accusations of the monitoring of Associated Press journalists. So like any presidency, you had some high points, you had some low points, but President Obama served 2 terms, taking office in 2009 and leaving office in 2017. The election of 2016 was extremely divisive and bitter because when President Obama finished his term in office, much like Vice President Dick Cheney before him, Vice President Joe Biden declined to run for the presidency. He had recently lost one of his sons, and he said he really just wanted to focus on his personal life and not run for office. So, former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton ran for the Democratic nomination and won it, and Donald Trump ran for the Republican nomination and won it. And then you had probably one of the nastiest campaigns that anyone has ever witnessed. It forced us to revisit some historical terms that we've learned in this course, such as nativism versus being welcoming to immigrants, nationalism versus a desire to be a much more active member of a global community, and the concept of Reagan-like peace through strength foreign policy versus less military strength, more diplomacy foreign policy. There were also some major issues that were being discussed amidst those revisited historical terms, such as slow economic growth. There were a lot of accusations thrown at the Obama presidency that the recovery from the financial crisis had not been a very strong one. Immigration, as mentioned before. Are there too many illegal aliens being allowed into the United States? Is there more that could be done? President Trump campaigned on "I'll build a wall" to keep people out, and then that sparked a almost completely separate debate on how effective would a wall even be. And then probably one of the biggest issues was trade. Should the United States be moving away from some of the free trade policies of the last 20 to 30 years and focusing more on what was referred to at the time as America First strategy in our trade policies? You can see a map here of the outcome of the election, and although he lost the popular vote, President Trump lost the popular vote, he was able to win certain key states in what was once known as like the industrial heartland, but came to be known as the Rust Belt because of the now shut down industry in those states, and those were the states of Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. When President Trump won those states, they single handedly won him the presidency. Now, the Trump presidency itself, very, very controversial. Right from the get go, you had accusations that Russia was collaborating with the Trump campaign and continuing to collaborate with his administration as a sitting president. There was a full Justice Department investigation into this issue, and there was no evidence found of any collaboration with Russia. Was there coercion? So, President Trump's first impeachment was over this issue. He was threatening foreign governments with cutting off foreign aid payments to them unless they would investigate President Trump's political rivals. Is American trade policy broken? Trump executed broad new tariffs globally, particularly against China, saying that China's manipulative trade practices were harming the United States and that he was finally going to put his foot down and combat those manipulative trade practices from China. Very controversial because there's many people that believe much more strongly in free trade and not having tariffs against foreign goods. Are our allies doing enough for themselves? President Trump absolutely hammered our NATO allies for not spending enough on their own security. When NATO was first formed, every member organization was supposed to set a goal of spending at least 2 or 3% of GDP, gross domestic product, on their own security. And the United States and only a few other members ever did reach that goal. Many of the other NATO members were not reaching that goal. And President Trump was saying, hey, it's time that you step up and pay for your own defense. We can't just shoulder the burden for you. Again, controversial because it was viewed as weakening NATO. And especially now that we are looking back upon this after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, was it the weaknesses created by these criticisms of NATO that led Russia to feel gutsy enough to do that? Was the January 6th of 2021 riot at the Capitol, was it a disorganized mob? Or was it a well-orchestrated insurrection? You heard that word being used a lot. An insurrection is an attempted overthrow of a government. President Trump's second impeachment was over this issue. Obviously controversial, although he was acquitted. Many people believed that this was not just a simple riot, but yes, an insurrection that was attempting to overthrow the government. What is the future of Trump and the Republican Party? Was MAGA, Make America Great Again, or as I mentioned before, America First, a flash in the pan moment? Or is this a bona fide political movement? So Make America Great Again, America First, is this here to stay or no? The most recent 2020 presidential election is deeply controversial. The big issues are surrounding character and the COVID-19 response. Had President Trump done enough to address the COVID-19 response? Would a President Biden do more? Character. A lot of people criticized the character of President Trump. There were also criticisms of President Biden and his possible involvement in business dealings with his controversial son, Hunter. So character and COVID-19 was kind of the rain cloud over both of these candidates. Was there election tampering? After the election was over, President Trump accused the Biden campaign of election tampering. And lastly, China. Where do we go from here? Do we continue with some of the tough on China trade policies of President Trump, or do we move in a completely new direction under President Biden? And frankly, only a little over a year into his term in office, the jury's still out on what direction that we seem to be moving with China. You can see the results of the election here. The same Rust Belt states that won President Trump the presidency in 2016 won President Biden the presidency in 2020. Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. He also picked up some states that had been won by President Trump in the previous election, such as Georgia, Arizona, and exit polls on the election really centered a lot of people's concerns around the character issue. And despite some of the clouds that hung over now President Biden during the campaign, so much more hung over President Trump that was the breaking point. So not only was President Trump controversial, he was so controversial that the controversies surrounding him overcame the controversies surrounding his opponent. And you can see here the comparisons of 2020 and 2016. President Trump having won the Rust Belt in 2016, and President Biden having won the Rust Belt, and a couple extra pickups in the 2020 election. That's the end of the presentation. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out. Otherwise, I'll see you in class.